Good evening, and welcome to Twilight Tales by Living Well and Wild, a series of fantasy bedtime stories for grown-ups. My name is Alexis, and I will be the narrator for your transition from the busy day to a comfortable and restorative slumber. I invite you to make yourself comfortable as we first settle in to a 2-1 breathing pattern. Practicing the 2-1 breathing technique before sleep can have beneficial effects on overall well-being by promoting relaxation and reducing anxiety. We will start by moving into an even inhale-exhale pattern. Begin with an inhale of 4 and an exhale of 4. Continue this pattern. Inhale 4, exhale 4. For the next few breaths. Inhale 4, exhale 4. Now we are going to adjust our breathing to achieve the 2-1 ratio. This simply means that your exhales are going to be twice as long as your inhales. I am going to use a 3-count inhale and 6-count exhale, but I encourage you to use whatever 2-1 pattern you are comfortable with. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Really focus on deepening the exhalation, pushing out all that additional air. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Take a few moments to settle into these breaths. Chapter 20, A Historical Fact. Amongst the weary hounds refreshed with fury and triumph, Orion stepped with his whip and drove them away from the monstrous dead body, and sent the lash quivering round in a wide circle, while in his other hand he took his sword and cut off the unicorn's head. He also took the skin of the long white neck and brought it away dangling empty from the head. All the while the hounds bayed and made eager rushes one by one at that magical carcass whenever one saw a chance of eluding the whip, so that it was long before Orion got his trophy, for he had to work as hard with his whip as with his sword. But at last he had it slung by a leather thong over his shoulders, the great horn pointing upwards past the right side of his head, and the smeared skin hanging down along his back. And while he arranged it thus, he allowed his hounds to worry the body again and taste that wonderful blood. Then he called to them and blew a note on his horn and turned slowly home towards Earl, and they all followed behind him. And the 2 foxes stole up to taste the curious blood, for they had sat and waited for this. While the unicorn was climbing his last hill, Orion felt such fatigue that he could have gone little further. But now that the heavy head hung from his shoulders, all his fatigue was gone, and he trod with a lightness such as he had in the mornings, for it was his first unicorn. And his hounds seemed refreshed, as though the blood they had lapped had some strange power in it, and they came home riotously, gambling and rushing ahead as when newly loosed from their kennels. Thus Orion came home over the downs in the night, till he saw the valley before him full of the smoke of Earl, where one late light was burning in a window of one of his towers. And, coming down the slopes by familiar ways, he brought his hounds to their kennels. And just before dawn had touched the heights of the downs, he blew his horn before his postern door. And the aged guardian of the door, when he opened it to Orion, saw the great horn of the unicorn bobbing over his head. This was the horn that was sent in later years as a gift from the Pope to King Francis. Benvenuto Cellini tells of it in his memoirs. He tells how Pope Clement sent for him and a certain Tobia, and ordered them to make designs for the setting of a unicorn's horn, the finest ever seen. Judge then of Orion's delight when the horn of the first unicorn he ever took was such as to be esteemed generations later the finest ever seen, and in no less a city than Rome, with all her opportunities to acquire and compare such things. For a number of these curious horns must have been available for the Pope to have selected for the gift the finest ever seen. But in the simpler days of my story, the rarity of the horn was so great that unicorns were still considered fabulous. The year of the gift to King Francis would be about 1530, the horn being mounted in gold, and the contract went to Tobia and not to Benvenuto Cellini. I mention the date because there are those who care little for a tale, if it be not here and there supported by history, and who even in history care more for fact than philosophy. If any such reader have followed the fortunes of Orion so far, he will be hungry by now for a date or a historical fact. As for the date, I give him 1530, while for the historical fact I select that generous gift recorded by Benvenuto Cellini, because it may well be that just where he came to unicorns, such a reader may have felt furthest away from history, and have felt loneliness just at this point for want of historical things. How the unicorn's horn found its way from the castle of Earl, and in what hands it wandered, and how it came at last to the city of Rome, would of course make another book. But all that I need say now about that horn is that Orion took the whole head to Threll, who took off the skin and washed it and boiled the skull for hours, and replaced the skin and stuffed the neck with straw. And Orion set it in the midmost place among all the heads that hung in the high hall. And the rumor went all through Earl, as swift as unicorns gallop, telling of this fine horn that Orion had won. So that the Parliament of Earl met again in the Forge of Gnarl. They sat at the table there debating the rumor, and others besides Threll had seen the head. And at first, for the sake of old divisions, some held to their opinion that there had been no unicorn. They drank Gnarl's goodly mead and argued against the monster. But after a while, whether Threll's argument convinced them, or whether, as is more likely, they yielded from generosity, which arose like a beautiful flower out of the mellow mead, Whatever it was, the debate of those that opposed the unicorn languished, and when the vote was put, it was declared that Orion had killed the unicorn, which he had hunted hither from beyond the fields we know. And at this they all rejoiced, for they saw at last the magic for which they had longed, and for which they had planned so many years ago, when all were younger and had had more hope in their plans. And as soon as the vote was taken, Gnarl brought out more mead, and they drank again to mark the happy occasion. For magic at last, said they, had come on Orion, and a glorious future surely awaited Earl. And the long room, and the candles, and the friendly men, and the deep comfort of mead made it easy to look a little way forward into time, and to see a year or so that had not yet come, and to see coming glories glowing a little way off. And they told again of the days, but nearer now, when the distant lands should hear of the vale they loved. They told again of the fame of the fields of Earl going from city to city. One praised its castle, another its huge high downs, another the vale itself all hidden from every land, another the dear quaint houses built by an olden folk, another the deep of the woods that lay over the skyline. And all spoke of the time when the wide world should hear of it all, because of the magic that there was in Orion. For they knew that the world has a quick ear for magic, and always turns toward the wonderful, even though it be nearly asleep. Their voices were high, praising magic, telling again of the unicorn, glorying in the future of Earl, when suddenly in the doorway stood the Freer. He was there in his long white robe with its trimming of mauve, in the door with a knight behind him. As they looked, in the light of their candles, they could see he was wearing an emblem on a chain of gold round his neck. Gnarl bade him welcome. Some moved a chair to the table, but he had heard them speak of the unicorn. He lifted his voice from where he stood and addressed them. "Cursed be unicorns," he said, "and all their ways, and all things that be magic." In the awe that suddenly changed the mellow room, one cried, "Master, curse not us." "Good Freer," said Gnarl, "we hunted no unicorn." But the Freer raised up his hand against unicorns and cursed them yet. "Cursed be their horn," he cried, "and the place where they dwell, and the lilies whereon they feed. Cursed be all songs that tell of them. Cursed be they utterly with everything that dwelleth beyond salvation." He paused to allow them to renounce the unicorns, standing still in the doorway, looking sternly into the room. And they thought of the sleekness of the unicorn's hide, his swiftness, the grace of his neck, and his dim beauty cantering by when he came past Earl in the evening. They thought of his stalwart and redoubtable horn. They remembered old songs that told of him. They sat in uneasy silence and would not renounce the unicorn. And the Freer knew what they thought, and he raised his hand again, clear in the candlelight with the knight behind him. "Cursed be their speed," he said, "and their sleek white hide. Cursed be their beauty, and all that they have of magic, and everything that walks by enchanted streams." And still he saw in their eyes a lingering love for those things that he forbade, and therefore he ceased not yet. He lifted his voice yet louder and continued, with his eye sternly upon those troubled faces. And cursed be trolls, elves, goblins, and fairies upon the earth, and hippogriffs and Pegasus in the air, and all the tribes of the merfolk under the sea. Our holy rites forbid them. And cursed be all doubts, all singular dreams, all fancies, and from magic may all true folk be turned away. Amen. He turned round suddenly and was into the night. A wind loitered about the door, then flapped it to, and the large room in the Forge of Gnarl was as it had been but a few moments before, yet the mellow mood of it seemed dull and dim. And then Gnarl spoke, rising up at the table's end and breaking the gloom of the silence. "Did we plan our plans," he said, "so long ago, and put our faith in magic, that we should now renounce magical things and curse our neighbors, the harmless folk beyond the fields we know, and the beautiful things of the air, and dead mariners' lovers dwelling beneath the sea?" "No, no," said some, and they quaffed their mead again. And then one rose with his horn of mead held high, then another, and then another, till all were standing upright all round the light of the candles. "Magic," one cried, and the rest with one accord took up his cry till all were shouting, "Magic." The Freer on his homeward way heard that cry of magic. He gathered his sacred robe more closely around him, and clutched his holy things, and set a spell that kept him from sudden demons and the doubtful things of the mist. Chapter 21. On the Verge of Earth. And on that day Orion rested his hounds. But the next day he rose early and went to his kennels, and loosened the joyous hounds in the shining morning, and led them out of the valley and over the downs towards the frontier of twilight again. And he took his bow with him no more, but only his sword and his whip, for he had come to love the joy of his 15 hounds when they hunted the one-horned monster, and felt that he shared the joy of every hound, while to shoot one with an arrow would be but a single joy. All day he went over the fields, greeting some farmer here and there, or worker in the field, and gaining greetings in return and good wishes for sport. But when evening came and he was near the frontier, fewer and fewer greeted him as he passed, for he was manifestly traveling where none went, whence even their thoughts held back. So he went lonely, yet cheered by his eager thoughts, and happy in the comradeship of his hounds, and both his thoughts and his hounds were all for the chase. And so he came to the barrier of twilight again, where the hedges ran down to it from the fields of men, and turned strange and dim in a glow that is not of our earth, and disappeared in the twilight. He stood with his hounds close in against one of these hedges just where it touched the barrier. The light just there on the hedge, if like anything of our earth, was like the misty dimness that flashes upon a hedge, seen only across one field when touched by the rainbow. In the sky the rainbow is clear, but close across one wide field the rainbow's end scarcely shows, yet a heavenly strangeness has touched and altered the hedge. In some such light as that glowed the last of the hawthorns that grew in the fields of men. And just beyond it, like a liquid opal, all full of wandering lights, lay the barrier through which no man can see, and no sound come but the sound of the elfin horns, and only that to the ears of very few. The horns were blowing now, piercing that barrier of dim light and silence with the magical resonance of their silver note that seemed to beat past all things intervening to come to Orion's ear as the sunlight beats through ether to illumine the veils of the moon. The horns died down, and nothing whispered from Elfland, and all the sounds thenceforth were the sounds of an earthly evening. Even these grew few, and still no unicorns came. A dog barked far away. A cart, the sole sound on an empty road, went homeward wearily. Someone spoke in a lane, and then left the silence unbroken, for words seemed to offend the hush that was over all our fields. And in the hush Orion gazed at the frontier, watching for the unicorns that never came, expecting each moment to see one step through the twilight. But he had done unwisely in coming to the same spot at which he had found the 5 unicorns only 2 days before. For of all creatures the unicorns are the wariest, guarding their beauty from the eye of man with never-ceasing watchfulness, dwelling all day beyond the fields we know, and only entering them rarely at evening, when all is still, and with the utmost vigilance, and venturing even then scarcely beyond the edges. To come on such animals twice at the same spot within 2 days with hounds, after hunting and killing one of them, was more unlikely than Orion thought. But his heart was full of the triumph of his hunt, and the scene of it lured him back to it in the way that such scenes have. And now he gazed at the frontier, waiting for one of these great creatures to come proudly through, a great tangible shape out of the dim opalescence. And no unicorn came. And standing, gazing there so long, that curious boundary began to lure him till his thoughts went roaming with its wandering lights, and he desired the peaks of Elfland. And well they knew that lure, who dwelt on those farms lying all along the edge of the fields we know, and wisely kept their eyes turned ever away from that wonder that lay with its marvel of colors so near to the backs of their houses. For there was a beauty in it such as is not in all our fields, and it is told those farmers in youth how, if they gaze upon those wandering lights, there will remain no joy for them in the goodly fields, the fine brown furrows or the waves of wheat, or in anything of ours, but their hearts will be far from here with elfin things, yearning always for unknown mountains and for folk not blessed by the freer. And standing now, while our earthly evening waned, upon the very edge of that magical twilight, the things of earth rushed swiftly from his remembrance, and suddenly all his care was for elfin things. Of all the folk that trod the paths of men, he remembered only his mother, and suddenly knew, as though the twilight had told him, that she was enchanted, and he of a magical line, and none had told him this, but he knew it now. For years he had wandered through many an evening and guessed where his mother had gone. He had guessed in lonely silence. None knew what the child was guessing, and now an answer seemed to hang in the air. It seemed as though she were only a little way off across the enchanted twilight that divided those farms from Elfland. He moved 3 steps and came to the frontier itself. His foot was the furthest that stood in the fields we know. Against his face the frontier lay like a mist, in which all the colors of pearls were dancing gravely. A hound stirred as he moved. The pack turned their heads and eyed him. He stood, and they rested again. He tried to see through the barrier, but saw nothing but wandering lights that were made by the massing of twilights from the ending of thousands of days, which had been preserved by magic to build that barrier there. Then he called to his mother across that mighty gap, those few preserved by magic, to build that barrier there. Then he upon one side earth and the haunts of men, and the time that we measure by minutes and hours and years, and upon the other Elfland and another way of time. He called to her twice and listened, and called again, and never a cry or a whisper came out of Elfland. He felt then the magnitude of the gulf that divided him from her, and knew it to be vast and dark and strong, like the gulfs that set apart our times from a bygone day, or that stand between daily life and the things of dream, or between folk tilling the earth and the heroes of song, or between those living yet and those they mourn. And the barrier twinkled and sparkled as though so airy a thing never divided lost years from that fleeting hour called now. He stood there with the cries of earth faint in the late evening behind him, and the mellow glow of the soft earthy twilight, and before him, close to his face, the utter silence of Elfland, and the barrier that made that silence, gleaming with its strange beauty. And now he thought no more of earthly things, but only gazed into that wall of twilight, as prophets tampering with forbidden lore gaze into cloudy crystals, and to all that was elvish in Orion's blood, to all that he had of magic from his mother. The little lights of the twilight-builded boundary lured and tempted and beckoned. He thought of his mother dwelling in lonely ease beyond the rage of time. He thought of the glories of Elfland, dimly known by magical memories that he had had from his mother. The little cries of the earthly evening behind him he heeded no more nor heard. And with all these little cries were lost to him also the ways and the needs of men, the things they plan, the things they toil for and hope for, and all the little things their patience achieves. In the new knowledge that had come to him beside this glittering boundary, that he was of magical blood, he desired at once to cast off his allegiance to time, and to leave the lands that lay under time's dominion, and were ever scourged by his tyranny, to leave them with no more than 5 short paces, and to enter the ageless land where his mother sat with her father while he reigned on his misty throne, in that hall of bewildering beauty at which only song has guessed. No more was Earl his home. No more were the ways of man his ways, their fields to his feet no more. But the peaks of the elfin mountains were to him now what welcoming eaves of straw are to earthly laborers at evening. The fabulous, the unearthly, were to Orion home. Thus had that barrier of twilight, too long seen, enchanted him. So much more magical was it than any earthly evening. And there are those that might have gazed long at it and even yet turned away, but not easily Orion. For though magic has power to charm worldly things, they respond to enchantment heavily and slowly, while all that was magic in Orion's blood flashed answer to the magic that shone in the rampart of Elfland. It was made of the rarest lights that wander in air, and the fairest flashes of sunlight that astonish our fields through storm, and the mists of little streams, and the glow of flowers in moonlight, and all the ends of our rainbows with all their beauty and magic, and scraps of the gloaming of evenings long treasured in aged minds. Into this enchantment he stepped to have done with mundane things, but as his foot touched the twilight, a hound that had sat behind him under the hedge, held back from the chase so long, stretched its body a little, and uttered one of those low cries of impatience, that amongst the ways of man most nearly resembles a yawn. And old habit at that sound made Orion turn his head, and he saw the hound and went up to him for a moment and patted him and would have said farewell. But all the hounds were around him then, nosing his hands and looking up at his face. And standing there amongst his eager hounds, Orion, who but a moment before was dreaming of fabulous things, with thoughts that floated over the magical lands and scaled the enchanted peaks of the elfin mountains, was suddenly at the call of his earthly lineage. It was not that he cared more to hunt than to be with his mother beyond the fret of time, in the lands of her father lovelier than anything song hath said. It was not that he loved his hounds so much that he could not leave them, but his fathers had followed the chase age after age, as his mother's line had timelessly followed magic, and the call towards magic was strong while he looked on magical things, and the old earthly line was as strong to beckon him to the chase. The beautiful boundary of twilight had drawn his desires towards Elfland. Next moment his hounds had turned him another way. It is hard for any of us to avoid the grip of external things. For some moments Orion stood thinking among his hounds, trying to decide which way to turn, trying to weigh the easy, lazy ages that hung over untroubled lawns and the listless glories of Elfland, with a good brown plough, and the pasture, and the little hedges of earth. But the hounds were around him, nosing, crying, looking into his eyes, speaking to him if tails and paws and large brown eyes can speak, saying, "Away, away." To think amongst all that tumult was impossible. He could not decide, and the hounds had it their way, and he and they went together home over the fields we know. Chapter 22. Orion Appoints a Whip. And many times again, while the winter wore away, Orion went back again with his hounds to that wonderful boundary, and waited there while the earthly twilight faded, and sometimes saw the unicorns come through, craftily, silently, when our fields were still great beautiful shapes of white. But he brought back no more horns to the castle of Earl, nor hunted again across the fields we know. For the unicorns, when they came, moved into our fields no more than a few bare paces, and Orion was not able to cut one off again. Once, when he tried, he nearly lost all his hounds, some being already within the boundary when he beat them back with his whip. Another 2 yards, and the sound of his earthly horn could never more have reached them. It was this that taught him that for all the power that he had over his hounds, and even though in that power was something of magic, yet one man without help could not hunt hounds so near to that edge over which if one should stray, it would be lost forever. After this, Orion watched the lads at their games in evenings in Earl, till he had marked 3 that in speed and strength seemed to excel the rest, and 2 of these he chose to be whippers in. He went to the cottage of one of them when the games were over, just as the lights were lit, a tall lad with great speed of limb. The lad and his mother were there, and both rose from the table as the father opened the door, and Orion came in. And cheerily Orion asked the lad if he would come with the hounds and carry a whip and prevent any from straying. And a silence fell. All knew that Orion hunted strange beasts and took his hounds to strange places. None there had ever stepped beyond the fields we know. The lad feared to pass beyond them. His parents were loath to let him go, At length the silence was broken by excuses and muttered sentences and unfinished things, and Orion saw that the lad would not come. He went then to the house of the other. There, too, the candles were lit and a table spread. There were 2 old women there and the lad at their supper, and to them Orion told how he needed a whipper-in, and asked the lad to come. Their fear in that house was more marked. The old women cried out together that the lad was too young, that he could not run so well as he used to, that he was not worthy of so great an honor, that dogs would never trust him. And much more than this they said, till they became incoherent. Orion left them and went to the house of the third. It was the same here. The elders had desired magic for Earl, but the actual touch of it, or the mere thought of it, perturbed the folk in their cottages. None would spare their sons to go whither they knew not, to have dealings with things that rumor, like a large and sinister shadow, had so grimly magnified in the hamlet of Earl. So Orion went alone with his hounds when he took them up from the valley, and went eastwards over our fields where earth's folk would not go. It was late in the month of March, and Orion slept in his tower, when there came up to him from far below, shrill and clear in the early morning, the sound of his peacocks calling. The bleat of sheep far up on the downs came to wake him too, and cocks were crowing clamorously, for spring was singing through the sunny air. He rose and went to his hounds, and soon early laborers saw him go up the steep side of the valley with all his hounds behind him, tan patches against the green. And so he passed over the fields we know, and so he was come, before the sun had set, to that strip of land from which all men turned away, where westward stood men's houses among fields of fat brown clay, and eastward the elfin mountains shone over the boundary of twilight. He went with his hounds along the last hedge down to the boundary, and no sooner had he come there than he saw a fox quite close slip out of the twilight between earth and elfland, and run a few yards along the edge of our fields, and then slip back again. And of this Orion thought nothing, for it is the way of the fox thus to haunt the edge of Elfland, and to return again to our fields. It is thus that he brings us something of which none of our cities guess. But soon the fox appeared again out of the twilight, and ran a little way, and was back in the luminous barrier once more. Then Orion watched to see what the fox was doing, and yet again it appeared in the field we know, and dodged back into the twilight. And the hounds watched too, and showed no longing to hunt it, for they had tasted fabulous blood. Orion walked along beside the twilight in the direction in which the fox was going, with his curiosity growing the more the fox dodged in and out of our fields. The hounds followed him slowly, and soon lost their interest in what the fox was doing. And all at once the curious thing was explained, for Lurulu all of a sudden skipped through the twilight, and that troll appeared in our fields. It was him that the fox was playing. "A man," said Lurulu aloud to himself, or to his comrade the fox, speaking in troll talk. And all at once Orion remembered the troll that had come into his nursery, with his little charm against time, and had leaped from shelf to shelf, and across the ceiling, and enraged Zerundarel, who had feared for her crockery. The troll, he said, also in troll talk, for his mother had murmured it to him as a child when she told him tales of the trolls and their age-old songs. "Who is this that knows troll talk?" said Lurulu. And Orion told his name, and this meant nothing to Lurulu. But he squatted down and rummaged a little while in what answers in trolls to our memory. And during his ransacking of much trivial remembrance that had eluded the destruction of time in the fields we know, and the listless apathy of unchanging ages in Elfland, he came all at once on his remembrance of Earl, and looked at Orion again and began to cogitate. And at this same moment Orion told to the troll the august name of his mother. At once Lurulu made what is known amongst the trolls of Elfland as the abasement of the 5 points. That is to say, he bowed himself to the ground on his 2 knees, his 2 hands, and his forehead. Then he sprang up again with a high leap into the air, for reverence rested not on his spirit long. "What are you doing in men's fields?" said Orion. "Playing," said Lurulu. "What do you do in Elfland?" "Watch time," said Lurulu. "That would not amuse me," said Orion. "You've never done it," said Lurulu. "You cannot watch time in the fields of men." "Why not?" asked Orion. "It moves too fast." Orion pondered a while on this, but could make nothing of it, because never having gone from the fields we know, he knew only 1 pace of time, and so had no means of comparison. "How many years have gone over you," asked the troll, "since we spoke in Earl?" "Years," said Orion. 100, guessed the troll. "Nearly 12, said Orion. "And you?" "It is still today," said the troll. And Orion would not speak any more of time, for he cared not for the discussion of a subject of which he appeared to know less than a common troll. "Will you carry a whip," he said, "and run with my hounds when we hunt the unicorn over the fields we know?" Lurulu looked searchingly at the hounds, watching their brown eyes. The hounds turned doubtful noses toward the troll and sniffed inquiringly. "They are dogs," said the troll, as though that were against them. "Yet they have pleasant thoughts." "You will carry the whip, then," said Orion. Yes, yes," said the troll. So Orion gave him his own whip there and then, and blew his horn and went away from the twilight, and told Lurulu to keep the hounds together and to bring them on behind him. And the hounds were uneasy at the sight of the troll, and sniffed again, but could not make him human, and were loath to obey a creature no larger than them. They ran up to him through curiosity, and ran away in disgust, and straggled through disobedience. But the boundless resources of that nimble troll were not thus easily thwarted, and the whip went suddenly up, looking 3 times as large in that tiny hand, and the lash flew forward and cracked on the tip of a hound's nose. The hound yelped, then looked astonished, and the rest were uneasy still. They must have thought it an accident. But again the lash shot forward and cracked on another nose tip, and the hounds saw then that it was not chance that guided those stinging shots, but a deadly, unerring eye. And from that time on they reverenced Lurulu, although he never smelt human. So went Orion and his pack of hounds in the late evening homewards, and no sheepdog kept the flock on wolf-haunted wold safer or closer than Lurulu kept the pack. He was on each flank or behind them, wherever a straggler was, and could leap right over the pack from side to side. And the pale blue elfin mountains faded from view before Orion had gone from the frontier as much as 100 paces, for their gloomless peaks were hid by the earthly darkness that was deepening wide over the fields we know. Homeward they went, and soon there appeared above them the wandering multitude of our earth-seen stars. Lurulu now and then looked up to marvel at them, as we have all done at some time, but for the most part he fixed his attention on the hounds, for now that he was in earthly fields, he was concerned with the things of earth. And never one hound loitered, but that Lurulu's whip would touch him, with its tiny explosion, perhaps on the tip of its tail, scattering a little dust of fragments of hair and whipcord, and the hound would yelp and run into the others, and all the pack would know that another of those unerring shots had gone home. A certain grace with a whip, a certain sureness of aim, comes when a life is devoted to the carrying of a whip amongst hounds, comes, say, in 20 years, and sometimes it runs in families, and that is better than years of practice. But neither years of practice nor the want of the whip in the blood can give the certain aim that one thing can, and that one thing is magic. The hurl of the lash, as immediate as the sudden turn of an eye, its flash to a chosen spot as direct as sight, were not of this earth. And though the cracks of that whip might have seemed to passing men to be no more than the work of an earthly huntsman, yet not a hound but knew that there was in it more than this, a thing from beyond our fields. There was a touch of dawn in the sky when Orion saw again the village of Earl, sending up pillars of smoke from earthly fires below him, and came with his hounds and his new whipper in down the side of the valley. Early windows winked at him as he went down the street and came in the silence and chill to the empty kennels. And when the hounds were all curled up on their straw, he found a place for Lurulu, a mouldering loft in which were sacks and a few heaps of hay. From a pigeon loft just beyond it, some of the pigeons had strayed and dwelt all along the rafters. There Orion left Lurulu and went to his tower, cold with the want of sleep and food, and weary as he would not have been if he had found a unicorn. But the noise of the troll's chatter when he had found him on the frontier had made it useless to watch for those wary beasts that evening. Orion slept, but the troll in the mouldering loft sat long on his bundle of hay, observing the ways of time. He saw through cracks in old shutters the stars go moving by. He saw them pale. He saw the other lights spread. He saw the wonder of sunrise. He felt the gloom of the loft all full of the coo of the pigeons. He watched their restless ways. He heard wild birds stir in near elms, and men abroad in the morning, and horses and carts and cows, and everything changing as the morning grew. A land of change. The decay of the boards in the loft, and the moss outside in the mortar, and old lumber mouldering away, all seemed to tell the same story. Change and nothing abiding. He thought of that age-old calm that held the beauty of Elfland, and then he thought of the tribe of trolls he had left, wondering what they would think of the ways of earth. And the pigeons were suddenly terrified by wild peals of Lurulu's laughter. Chapter 23. Lurulu watches the restlessness of earth. As the day wore on, and still Orion slept heavily, and even the hounds lay silent in their kennels a little way off, and the coming and going of men and carts below had nothing to do with the troll, Lurulu began to feel lonely. So thick are the brown trolls in the dells they inhabit that none feels lonely there. They sit there silent, enjoying the beauty of Elfland or their own impudent thoughts, or at rare moments when Elfland is stirred from its deep natural calm, their laughter floods the dells. They were no more lonely there than rabbits are. But in all the fields of earth there was only one troll, and that troll felt lonely. The door of the pigeon loft was open some 10 feet from the door of the hayloft, and some 6 feet higher. A ladder led to the hayloft, clamped to the wall with iron. But nothing at all communicated with the pigeon loft, lest cats should go that way. From it came the murmur of abundant life, which attracted the lonely troll. The jump from door to door was nothing to him, and he landed in the pigeon loft in his usual attitude, with a look of impudent welcome upon his face. But the pigeons poured away on a roar of wings through their windows, and the troll was still lonely. He liked the pigeon loft as soon as he looked at it. He liked the signs that he saw of teeming life, the 100 little houses of slate and plaster, the myriad feathers, and the musty smell. He liked the age-old ease of the sleepy loft, and the huge spider's webs that draped the corners, holding years and years of dust. He did not know what cobwebs were, never having seen them in Elfland, but he admired their workmanship. The age of the pigeon loft that had filled the corners with cobwebs, and broken patches of plaster away from the wall, shooing ruddy bricks beneath, and laid bare the laths in the roof and even the slates beyond, gave to the dreamy place an air not unlike to the calm of Elfland. But below it and all around, Lurulu noted the restlessness of earth. Even the sunlight through the little ventilation holes that shone on the wall moved. Presently there came the roar of the pigeons' returning wings and the crash of their feet on the slate roof above him, but they did not yet come in again to their homes. He saw the shadow of this roof cast on another roof below him, and the restless shadows of the pigeons along the edge. He observed the gray lichen covering most of the lower roof, and the neat round patches of newer yellow lichen on the shapeless mass of the gray. He heard a duck call out slowly 6 or 7 times. He heard a man come into a stable below him and lead a horse away. A hound woke and cried out. Some jackdaws, disturbed from some tower, passed over high in the air with boisterous voices. He saw big clouds go hurrying along the tops of far hills. He heard a wild pigeon call from a neighboring tree. Some men went by talking, and after a while he perceived, to his astonishment, what he had had no leisure to notice on his previous visit to Earl, that even the shadows of houses moved. For he saw that the shadow of the roof under which he sat had moved a little on the roof below, over the gray and yellow lichen. Perpetual movement and perpetual change. He contrasted it, in wonder, with the deep calm of his home, where the moment moved more slowly than the shadows of houses here, and did not pass until all the content with which a moment is stored had been drawn from it by every creature in Elfland. And then, with a whirring and whining of wings, the pigeons began to come back. They came from the tops of the battlements of the highest tower of Earl, on which they had sheltered a while, feeling guarded by its great height and its hoary age from this strange new thing that they feared. They came back and sat on the sills of their little windows and looked in with one eye at the troll. Some were all white, but the gray ones had rainbow-colored necks that were scarce less lovely than those colors that made the splendor of Elfland. And Lurulu, as they watched him suspiciously where he sat in a corner, longed for their dainty companionship. And when these restless children of a restless air and earth still would not enter, he tried to soothe them with the restlessness to which they were accustomed, and in which he believed all folk that dwelt in our fields delighted. He leapt up suddenly. He sprang onto a slate-built house for a pigeon high on a wall. He darted across to the next wall and back to the floor, but there was an outcry of wings and the pigeons were gone. And gradually he learned that the pigeons preferred stillness. Their wings roared back soon to the roof. Their feet thumped and clicked on the slates again, but not for long did they return to their homes. And the lonely troll looked out of their windows, observing the ways of earth. He saw a water wagtail light on the roof below him. He watched it until it went. And then 2 sparrows came to some corn that had been dropped on the ground. He noted them too. Each was an entirely new genus to the troll, and he showed no more interest as he watched every moment of the sparrows than should we if we met with an utterly unknown bird. When the sparrows were gone, the duck quacked again, so deliberately that another 10 minutes passed while Lurulu tried to interpret what it was saying. And although he desisted then because other interests attracted him, he felt sure it was something important. Then the jackdaws tumbled by again, but their voices sounded frivolous, and Lurulu did not give them much attention. To the pigeons on the roof that would not come home he listened long, not trying to interpret what they were saying, yet satisfied with the case as the pigeons put it, feeling that they told the story of life and that all was well. And he felt as he listened to the low talk of the pigeons that earth must have been going on for a long time. Beyond the roofs the tall trees rose up, leafless except for evergreen oaks and some laurels and pines and yews, and the ivy that climbed up trunks. But the buds of the beech were getting ready to burst, and the sunlight glittered and flashed on the buds and leaves, and the ivy and laurel shone. A breeze passed by, and some smoke drifted from some near chimney. Far away, Lurulu saw a huge gray wall of stone that circled a garden all asleep in the sun, and clear in the sunlight he saw a butterfly sail by and swoop when it came to the garden. And then he saw 2 peacocks go slowly past. He saw the shadow of the roofs darkening the lower part of the shining trees. He heard a cock crow somewhere, and a hound spoke out again. And then a sudden shower rained on the roofs, and at once the pigeons wanted to come home. They alighted outside their little windows again, and all looked sideways at the troll. Lurulu kept very still this time, and after a while the pigeons, though they saw that he was by no means one of themselves, agreed that he did not belong to the tribe of cat, and returned at last to the street of their tiny houses, and there continued their curious age-old tale. And Lurulu longed to repay them with curious tales of the trolls, the treasured legends of Elfland, but found that he could not make them understand troll talk. So he sat and listened to them talking, till it seemed to him they were trying to lull the restlessness of earth, and thought that they might, by drowsy incantation, be putting some spell against time, though which it could not come to harm their nests, for the power of time was not made clear to him yet, and he knew not yet that nothing in our fields has the strength to hold out against time. The very nests of the pigeons were built on the ruins of old nests, on a solid layer of crumbled things that time had made in that pigeon loft, as outside it the strata are made from the ruins of hills. So vast and ceaseless a ruin was not yet clear to the troll, for his sharp understanding had only been meant to guide him through the lull and the calm of Elfland, and he busied himself with a tinier consideration. Foreseeing that the pigeons seemed now amicable, he leapt back to his hayloft and returned with a bundle of hay, which he put down in a corner to make himself comfortable there. When the pigeons saw all this movement, they looked at him sideways again, jerking their necks queerly, but in the end decided to accept the troll as a lodger, and he curled up on his hay and listened to the history of Earth, which he believed the tale of the pigeons to be, though he did not know their language. But the day wore on and hunger came on the troll, far sooner than it ever did in Elfland, where even when he was hungry, he had no more to do than to reach up and take the berries that hung low from the trees that grew in the forest that bordered the dells of the trolls. And it is because the trolls eat them whenever hunger comes on them, which it rarely does, that these curious fruits are called troll berries. He leaped now from the pigeon loft and scampered abroad, looking all round for troll berries. And there were no berries at all, for there is but one season for berries, as we know well. It is one of the tricks of time. But that all the berries on earth should pass away for a period was to the troll too astounding to be comprehended at all. He was all among farm buildings, and presently he saw a rat humping himself slowly along through a dark shed. He knew nothing of rat talk, but it is a curious thing that when any two folk are after the same thing, each somehow knows what the other is after at once as soon as he sees him. We are all partially blind to other folks' occupations, but when we meet anyone engaged in our own pursuit, then somehow we soon seem to know without being told. And the moment that Lurulu saw the rat in the shed, he seemed to know that it was looking for food. So he followed the rat quietly, and soon the rat came up to a sack of oats, and to open that took him no longer than it does to shell a row of peas, and soon he was eating the oats. "Are they good?" said the troll in troll talk. The rat looked at him dubiously, noting his resemblance to man, and on the other hand his unlikeness to dogs. But on the whole the rat was dissatisfied, and after a long look turned away in silence and went out of the shed. Then Lurulu ate the oats and found they were good. When he had had enough oats, the troll returned to the pigeon loft and sat a long while there at one of the little windows, looking out across the roofs at the strange new ways of time. And the shadow upon the trees went higher, and the glitter was gone from the laurels and all the lower leaves. And then the light of the ivy leaves and the holm oaks turned from silvery to pale gold, and the shadow went higher still, all the world full of change. An old man with a narrow, long white beard came slowly to the kennels and opened the door and went in and fed the hounds with meat that he brought from a shed. All the evening rang with the hounds' outcry, and presently the old man came out again, and his slow departure seemed to the watchful troll yet more of the restlessness of earth. And then a man came slowly leading a horse to the stable below the pigeon loft, and went away again and left the horse eating. The shadows were higher now on walls and roofs and trees. Only the treetops and the tip of a high belfry had the light any longer. The ruddy buds on high beeches were glowing now like dull rubies, and a serenity came in the pale blue sky, and small clouds leisurely floated there, turned to a flaming orange, past which the rooks went homewards to some clump of trees under the downs. It was a peaceful scene, and yet to the troll, as he watched in the musty loft amongst generations of feathers, the noise of the rooks and their multitude thronging the sky, the dull, continual sound of the horse eating, the leisurely sound now and then of homeward feet, and the slow shutting of gates, seemed to be proof that nothing ever rested in all the fields we know, and the sleepy, lazy village that dreamed in the Vale of Earl, and that knew no more of other lands than their folk knew of its story, seemed to that simple troll to be a vortex of restlessness. And now the sunlight was gone from the highest places, and a moon a few days old was shining over the pigeon loft, out of sight of Lurulu's window, but filling the air with a strange new tint. And all these changes bewildered him, so that he thought a while of returning to Elfland, but the whim came again to his mind to astonish the other trolls. And while this whim was on him, he slipped down from the loft and went to find Orion.